king of German mercenaries.
Chapter 326 Shock-absorbing carriage stimulated by Marin's bounty. Da Vinci and his team of craftsmen worked overtime to develop spring steel. In particular, Da Vinci worked very hard to get Marin's support and marry Lisa. Finally, Leonardo da Vinci and his craftsmen developed a spring steel with a few flaws. The so-called flaw is that the 65 Mn ordinary spring steel they made lacks chromium and nickel. Although the content of these two elements is very small, it still has a little impact on the quality. In addition, other ingredients such as manganese, silicon, copper, etc. are all present. But Leonardo da Vinci and others were very troubled to control the proportions required by Marin. Manganese was naturally made from the pyrolusite that Marin sent people to Venice to buy, and copper was easier to deal with. But Leonardo da Vinci didn't know much about silicon. So Marin simply asked him to add high-purity quartz sand to the steelmaking crucible. Then, he gave him a calculation formula and told him the proportion of manganese content in pyrolusite and the proportion of silicon in quartz sand. In this way, Leonardo da Vinci and others finally produced spring steel with slight defects, no chromium or nickel. Then, they encountered troubles in the quenching stage. Craftsmen of this era are basically accustomed to water quenching. Water quenching makes spring steel harder, but also more brittle, affecting the elasticity of the spring. Finally, Marin suggested that they use oil quenching. Coincidentally, the whaling ship killed a small whale and brought back a lot of whale oil. So Marin asked them to try to quench with whale oil. Then, the spring steel was successfully tried. In fact, Marin remembered that the quenching of special steel was a very profound subject in later generations. In addition to water quenching and oil quenching, various chemicals were added to the quenching liquid to enhance the performance of the steel. But Marin obviously didn't understand the quenching process. He only knew that there were water quenching, oil quenching, and dual medium quenching that mixed water quenching and oil quenching. But dual medium quenching was difficult to study, and he didn't want any high-end springs, so he simply used oil quenching. Due to the lack of chromium and nickel elements and the inferior craftsmanship to modern times, Marin estimated that this 65 spring steel was not as good as modern ones. So, after winding a very thick car spring, he found that its bearing capacity was limited. Marin had never driven a car in his previous life, but the wheels of the pedal electric vehicle he rode had spring shock absorbers. The principle was very simple, that is, a relatively thick spiral spring was covered. When pressure is applied to the frame, the pump handle will transfer the pressure to the spring. The spring begins to deform, but because the spring is restricted by the steel cylinder similar to the pump, it will not deform horizontally, but only longitudinally. When the spring deforms, the pressure from the frame is fully offset, which greatly reduces the vibration of the vehicle body. Marin directed the craftsmen to make 4 spring shock absorbers, installed them between the frame and wheels of a 4-wheeled carriage, and conducted experiments. It turned out that the largest spring shock absorber they could make, with 4 in total, could only bear a maximum weight of 1.5 tons. If the weight was greater, the spring would be easily crushed. This bearing capacity was only used on small displacement private cars in later generations. It could not be used on slightly larger private cars. But in this era, the weight of a 4-wheeled carriage was not large. A closed carriage that could carry 2 people usually weighed no more than 1 ton. Only a carriage like the British Golden Coach, which carried several people, would weigh 3 tons. Of course, that was because the carriage was too luxurious. Not only was there a lot of space, but it also used a lot of high-density gold, which resulted in the carriage weighing more than 3 tons. Generally, a carriage with 2 seats, even if covered with steel plates, would not weigh more than 1.5 tons with passengers. So Marin immediately ordered craftsmen to build a carriage with steel plates and glass windows for 2 seats, can also accommodate 3 people, keeping the weight of the carriage, including 3 passengers, within 1.5 tons, and installing spring shock absorbers. After testing, the new carriage had very good shock absorption performance, compared to carriages without shock absorbers, and it was extremely comfortable to ride. With the ball bearings developed earlier, the new carriage extremely comfortable. So Marin invited Angela, his mother-in-law, and Felice to ride in. The 3 women were very surprised when they got on the carriage with good shock absorption performance. Then, Angela once again started her passion for riding in a carriage touring around. You know, before, riding in a carriage without shock absorbers, it was always bumpy. Now with shock absorbers, the carriage is too comfortable. The ancients talked about the fatigue of riding a horse, but modern people can't really understand it. Because modern vehicles are equipped with shock absorbers. When modern people take long-distance buses, many of them actually. But what if you try riding an ancient horse-drawn carriage? It's so bumpy. Maybe you just fell asleep, and suddenly there's a violent jolt that wakes you up instantly and makes you feel extremely uncomfortable. Moreover, in ancient times, there were no smooth cement roads or asphalt roads, and most of the roads were bumpy and uneven. Without shock absorbers, people would vomit out their overnight meals. Therefore, in ancient times, every time you traveled a long distance in a carriage, it was a very painful thing, especially for people with weak constitutions. Even a young man like Marin was not used to riding in a carriage. Every time he traveled a long distance, Marin rode a horse. Although riding a horse is also bumpy, as long as you master the skills and adjust your body according to the rhythm of getting on and off the horse, it is not as uncomfortable as riding in a carriage. Only people who don't know how to ride a horse and sit stiffly on the saddle will feel bumpy and uncomfortable. After Angela, her mother and her two daughters had ridden the new carriage back and forth from Auric to Emden, Angela excitedly told Marin that she had fallen asleep in the carriage because it was so comfortable. In his heart, Marin actually didn't agree. When in his previous life did he take a long-distance bus without sleeping, but on the surface, he still showed a surprised expression as Angela expected. In fact, if Marin had not added steel plates to the outside for safety reasons to prevent assassinations, the carriage could have been converted into an open-top carriage or used a wooden body, and it would have been no problem for it to carry 4 strong men. Then, Marin asked the craftsman to make several spring shock absorbers and hit several other carriages. However, the thicker shock absorber springs are difficult to wind and process. During the processing, even the most skilled craftsmen are prone to waste. Therefore, this kind of spring is destined to not be mass-produced. Moreover, due to the limited bearing capacity of the spring, it cannot be applied to cargo carriages. Because the weight of the cargo carriage often exceeds 1.5 tons, even if a shock-absorbing spring is installed, it is easy to be crushed. However, Marin invented the shock-absorbing spring not for transporting goods, but for the enjoyment of the nobles. As a result, all members of the Hoffmann family got a shock-absorbing carriage for convenient travel. Then, the families of the brothers Schwartz, Frundsberg and Konkoller, as well as important officials of the earldom such as Geoffrey, also received shock-absorbing carriages as rewards from Marin. For a time, shock-absorbing carriages became the best choice for the nobles of East Frisia. Because riding in shock-absorbing carriages was so comfortable. Many noble families began to ride in carriages to visit relatives and even hold gatherings among the ladies. Of course, it was also meant to show off their own carriages. For example, some families who received rewards from Marin would often go to the homes of their good sisters who were not rewarded with shock-absorbing carriages and invite them to ride in comfortable shock-absorbing carriages. Then, they would enjoy watching the envious eyes of their good sisters. The most important thing is that the shock-absorbing carriage cannot be copied by others. Some blacksmiths did start to copy Marin's shock absorbers and made springs. However, they used ordinary iron to wind the springs, not even steel. Then, those copycat shock-absorbing carriages worked well for the first few times, but after a few uses, the springs deformed or broke directly, almost causing serious accidents. The deformed springs can no longer provide the shock-absorbing function. As a result, the copycat shock-absorbing carriages soon withdrew from the market. Marin's carriages are not only of good quality, but Marin also marks the maximum load capacity for each carriage. Because the maximum weight of a carriage cannot exceed 1.5 tons. Therefore, after each carriage is sent out, Marin will use 1.5 tons minus the weight of the carriage, mark the maximum load in pounds, and warn users not to overload, otherwise the shock absorber will have problems. In addition, because the springs are not rust-proof, they usually need to be oiled for protection. Once the springs are rusted, they need to be replaced in time. Otherwise, rusted spring steel is also easy to break. Chapter 327, Marin also fell into the trap. In fact, what Marin, who does not understand metallurgy, does not know is that the addition of chromium and nickel to spring steel is actually to prevent the spring from rusting. Therefore, the mediocre performance of the springs made by Marin's craftsmen is actually because the heat treatment process is not well controlled and needs to be improved. As an important metal workpiece, springs cannot be easily rusted. Once rusted, they are easily deformed and broken. Therefore, in order to prevent rust, people add chromium and nickel, the main components of stainless steel. Therefore, the springs used by Marin need to be replaced and oiled regularly, while springs with chromium-nickel components are less troublesome. Fortunately, Marin has plenty of whale oil, so he can use it freely. As for others, they can also use butter, mutton fat and olive oil as protective oil. Marin had invented the shock-absorbing carriage, so he naturally wanted to show it off. Anyway, even if others knew the structure, they couldn't copy it because ordinary iron couldn't be used to make springs. Even if they did, the performance would be far inferior. Since he had sent his men away, Marin also prepared a few to send to his allies, such as Duke John II of Clever, Grand Master Philip of the Teutonic Army, and Maximilian I, Marin's current political backer. Therefore, several shock-absorbing carriages and some spare springs in sealed packages were sent to these three places together. In addition, Marin also sent one to his uncle Jules. In fact, the Grand Master of the Teutonic Knights, Philip, was only in his early 30s, in the prime of his life. Moreover, as the Grand Master of the Teutonic Knights, he usually rode a horse and rarely used a carriage. However, Maximilian I and Duke John II of Cleves were both old and rarely rode horses, but often rode in carriages. It would be great to give them a shock-absorbing carriage. However, what Marin didn't expect was that his kind gift of the carriage this time made him fall into a big pit. The thing is, Marin sent shock-absorbing carriages to the Grand Master of the Teutonic Empire, his uncle Jules, Duke John II of Cleves, and Maximilian I. Originally, the various forces were very grateful for the gift sent by Marin. But when sending the carriage to Maximilian I, they encountered a big trouble. Of course, Maximilian I was not dissatisfied with the carriage. Rather, the poor emperor was being beaten by the Swiss mercenaries and could only hide in the fortress to defend it. Moreover, Maximilian I also heard the news that King Louis XII of France had released 5,000 elite Swiss mercenaries to fight against, and he was anxious about it. As luck would have it, Marin sent a shock-absorbing carriage at this time, and Maximilian I suddenly remembered I sent Marin a very powerful fighter. You have reinforcements, and so do I. Moreover, how brilliant is Marin's record? 10,000 people beat more than 20,000 Saxon troops. You know, the combat effectiveness of the Saxon army is one of the best in the entire German region, not inferior to the Habsburg family army. Of course, it can't be compared with the Swiss. But even if the Swiss took action, they could not completely wipe out the 20,000 plus Saxon troops with only 10,000 men. At most, they could only defeat and repel them. In fact, it was also because Marin had chosen the battlefield location. If the pontoon bridge that the Saxon army used to cross the river had not been destroyed by warships, more than half of the Saxon army would have escaped. Thinking of this, the emperor finally got excited. So he asked the knight who came to deliver the carriage to take a letter back to Marin. This letter was not an order from the emperor, but a request. Marin is now fully grown and no longer the little man he once was. After defeating the Saxon army, Marin has become a bad guy that no one dares to provoke. Therefore, when the emperor communicates with Marin, he can no longer be as bossy as before. This is the advantage of holding a large army. When Maximilian I's letter for help was delivered to Marin, Marin felt that it was not a letter, but an extremely hot potato. He began to regret why he loved to show off so much. Now, because of the carriage, the emperor thought of him and asked him to send troops. Now Marin is in a dilemma. If he sends troops, he is surrounded by enemies and it is easy for them to take over his lair. If he does not send troops, his relationship with the emperor will definitely be broken. Marin didn't have many allies, and if his relationship with the emperor broke down, he would be left with no friends. In the future, if he fought with others, he would be easily beaten up by a group of people. You know, although the emperor is cowardly, he is the emperor after all. With the emperor's halo, others who want to beat Marin up have to give the emperor some face. Only people like the Duke of Saxony, who are very powerful and owe the emperor too many favors, dare to ignore the emperor's face. If those ordinary nobles dared to join the fight against Marin, the emperor would issue an edict to give his fief to the nobles of the neighboring families, which would immediately disintegrate their alliance. Because, faced with the temptation of territory, some people would take risks. Just like the Duke of Saxony, who took risks just for the territory of the county of East Frisia. However, the emperor himself was a pure European, not so wretched. If it were the Chinese emperor, with a powerful advisor, he would have instigated the nobles to kill each other long ago. After all, the emperor's edict is sometimes useless, but sometimes very useful. For example, there is a gold mine near the border between country A and country B, which currently belongs to country B, but country A is coveting it. At this time, if there is a conflict between country B and the emperor can send an imperial edict to country A, clearly giving country B's gold mine to country A. In this way, with an imperial edict in its favor, country A will take risks and fight fiercely with country B. Under normal circumstances, country A can ignore the emperor who has little power. However, when the emperor sends an edict that is beneficial to itself, country A can't help but accept it and follow the instructions of the edict to grab huge benefits. After all, this edict is greatly beneficial to country A. The so-called princes are separatist forces with heavy military forces. When they face the emperor's edict, they usually choose to accept the ones that are beneficial to them and ignore the ones that are not beneficial to them. However, as long as the contradictions and disputes among the princes are used well, the powerless emperor can also instigate the princes to fight each other. Of course, Marin would not give Maximilian I such a bad idea. Because he himself is now a great prince. If the emperor uses such a method to greatly weaken the power of various princes and let the Habsburg family unify Germany, he will also suffer. After all, Marin himself has always been used to being the boss and is unwilling to be inferior to others. Thinking of the unified China, where those nobles were kept like pigs in the capital, Marin shuddered in his heart and thought it would be better to maintain the status quo. However, the Swiss could not be allowed to defeat the emperor. If the emperor lost, the consequences would be serious. Perhaps the imperial parliament would take the opportunity to depose Maximilian I. Changing someone to be the emperor may not be beneficial to Marin. If Marin's enemy becomes the emperor and calls on all the princes of Germany to gang up on him, it would be tragic. Therefore, Marin's decision was to support the emperor to a limited extent, neither letting the emperor fail nor letting him have the ability to completely defeat the Swiss. Chapter 328, Divide the forces for support. Based on the principle of limited support, Marin thought for a long time and decided to send part of the troops to support the emperor. As a result, it would be best for the emperor to repel the Swiss attack, but he would not be able to launch a counterattack. So, Marin thought about it and finally decided to send 2 phalanxes to support. 2 phalanxes are nothing in a head-on confrontation on the battlefield. However, the emperor's army is now relying on the pass to resist the attack of the Swiss. Therefore, 2 phalanxes are definitely enough. Of course, Marin decided to increase the proportion of musketeers. For example, before, there were only 300 musketeers in one phalanx. But for the 2 phalanxes supporting the emperor, Marin decided to equip each phalanx with 400 musketeers. The 2 phalanxes added up to 2,500 people, and there were 800 musketeers. 800 musketeers, relying on the city walls and bunkers to counterattack, are quite powerful. Because, hiding behind the defense line, they don't have to worry about being attacked and killed by the enemy, and can leisurely reload and then aim and shoot. You should know that in 1529, when the Ottoman Turkish Sultan Suleiman I led an army of 250,000 to besiege Vienna, the Vienna defenders relied on 72 muskets to fight off the Turkish charge at the gap in the city wall blasted open by the Turks and defended Vienna. Of course, that was because the Turks did not understand the power of the volley gun at that time. However, even the Swiss did not know much about the power of the volley gun at that time. Only the unfortunate Saxons truly experienced the power of the volley gun. Moreover, when defending a city, the power of volley guns is much greater than that of field battles. Because in field battles, as long as the enemy rushes over quickly, the musketeers have to retreat and let the spearmen take over. Therefore, in field battles, the musketeers' performance is limited in time. But in defending the city, the musketeers have the natural advantage of the terrain, and with the huge power of the musket, they can completely suppress the enemy. Even if the enemy has warriors wearing full sets of armor, it is difficult to climb the city. Wearing armor may be able to withstand the attack of archers, but facing muskets, it is the same whether you wear armor or not. Moreover, the lethality of muskets is relatively large, and the damage they cause looks bloody, which can make the enemy feel more terrified. Especially the muskets used by the musketeers under Marin, the bullets weighed 50 grams and had extremely amazing destructive power. When they hit a person, they would cause a huge wound as big as a bowl, and blood would spurt out, which was very scary. If the volley of gunfire caused huge casualties to the enemy, the survivors would also feel terrified when seeing the terrible wounds on their comrades. Then, the next question was the choice of commander. Schwarz was ruled out first because he was a man whom Marin trusted very much. To be honest, Schwarz's ability is not as good as that of the more talented Frundsberg. After all, the Schwarz family declined early, and he did not receive a complete knight education since childhood. Unlike Frundsberg, who received a strict military education since childhood and had a more flexible mind. However, Schwarz has one thing that Frundsberg cannot compare to. That is, Schwarz is very loyal to Marin, and he carries out any order of Marin without hesitation, regardless of right or wrong. As long as it is Marin's order, even if he is asked to do something bad, Schwarz will not have any objection. In Schwarz's eyes, Marin's will is his pursuit. In short, Schwarz is a fanatical supporter of Marin. But Frundsberg was different, because he grew up in an aristocratic family and had independent thinking ability. Even when he was receiving training from Marin, he would put forward his own opinions. Originally, this was an advantage. However, Marin's knowledge was hundreds of years ahead of people of this era. Frundsberg's own views were actually based on the thinking of people of this era. Therefore, his personal views often did not have a better effect. For example, Frundsberg preferred fair and square knight duels and opposed sneak attacks. This was a common problem among officers from knight families in this era. Their pursuit of honor reached a pathological level. Although Schwartz's ancestors were also knights, his father was no longer a member of the knight family. Therefore, Schwartz did not attach much importance to honor, but paid more attention to results. In this regard, Schwartz and Marin were more in sync. Moreover, due to the massacre of the old nobles of East Frisia and the treatment of the noble women, Frundsberg and Marin had already had a rift in their hearts. Frundsberg even thought that Marin was too cruel and lacked the honor of a knight. Marin was also very clear about this. However, to be honest, the father of German mercenaries is the father of German mercenaries. Among the dozens of knights under Marin, Frundsberg is considered to be the most talented. Marin wanted to train Schwartz, the most loyal one, to be the best in the army. However, the existence of Frundsberg, whose qualifications and abilities were no less than Schwartz, blocked Schwartz's path to advancement. Because, in terms of qualifications and abilities, Frundsberg was no less than Schwartz, and even better in abilities. The above are all secondary. In fact, the most important reason that made Marin more inclined to Schwartz was that Marin once tested the loyalty of his generals while he was half asleep and half drunk. Marin asked his generals very obscurely, if there was a conflict between him and the emperor, which side would they stand on? As a result, Schwartz, Kahn, Saul and some generals said without hesitation that they would stand on Marin's side. However, Frundsberg said that Marin should be loyal to the emperor forever and should not be hostile to the emperor. It was this test that broke Marin's heart. Frundsberg was promoted by Marin from a plate armor heavy cavalryman and trained as a general. Unexpectedly, after a few years, Marin's importance in his mind was not as high as that of the emperor. This test finally strengthened Marin's determination to train Schwartz. As for Frundsberg, Marin didn't know how to deal with him. After all, Frundsberg didn't make any mistakes. In theory, loyalty to the emperor and patriotism are politically correct. However, Marin is ambitious. Marin hopes that in the future, like Prussia, he can occupy the northern half of Germany and become an independent country. In other words, Marin may part ways with the Habsburg family and establish an independent country in the later period. But Frundsberg, one of the most powerful generals under Marin, was more inclined to the emperor, which Marin was not happy about. Frundsberg was still young, and he might still be in power when Marin established an independent country in the future. If his generals did not agree to establish an independent country separate from the Holy Roman Empire, it would be a big deal. Maybe it would even trigger a civil war. Therefore, Marin finally made up his mind to kick Frundsberg out. But how to kick him out made Marin a little confused. After all, he didn't want to kill Frundsberg, a meritorious general who had done nothing wrong, for no reason, but he also didn't want him to become the top general under his command and control the military power. Just then, the emperor came to ask for help, and Marin had an idea, to give Frundsberg to the emperor. The final commander of the reinforcements of the two phalanxes was decided to be Frundsberg. Frundsberg was the second most important general under Marin, and it was indeed a great honor for the emperor to have him come forward. Moreover, Frundsberg himself was also very happy to serve the emperor. After all, he was from the Swabian region and was naturally close to the emperor politically. Marin's plan was to let Frundsberg lead two phalanxes to serve the emperor for a long time. After all, Maximilian I was born with a miserable life and had to fight endless battles in his life. Frundsberg was sent to the emperor, so he would not worry about being useless. You know, the emperor and his Habsburg family were very keen to recover Switzerland, their ancestral fiefdom. If he was stronger, the emperor would definitely have planned to recover Switzerland. But Marin knew that the Swiss were so unruly and strong in military power. The emperor's road to conquering Switzerland would be extremely difficult. Even if he really conquered it, he would face fierce resistance. In short, once the emperor fell into the trap of Switzerland, he could not think of doing anything else. Even Marin, after completing the modernization of the army, only had the confidence to conquer Switzerland, but not to stabilize Switzerland. What's more, the army's strength was not as good as that of the Swiss emperor. Of course, Marin did not want to give the two phalanxes of reinforcements to the emperor for nothing. Therefore, Marin's plan was that the salaries of the soldiers of the two phalanxes would still be paid by Marin. Of course, the supply of food and ammunition had to be paid by the emperor himself. In this way, the salaries were paid by himself, and these soldiers would naturally be more inclined to him. And the emperor had to accept his favor by using them to fight. Marin also gave face to Frundsberg and appointed him as the representative minister of the county of East Frisia to represent Marin and serve the emperor. At the same time, all of Frundsberg's rights and interests in the East Frisian county remained intact, such as the manor, the castle, and the taxes on his fiefdom were still tax-free. Before departure, Marin and Frundsberg had an in-depth conversation. During the conversation, Marin did not object to Frundsberg teaching the Marin phalanx to the Emperor's army. But in terms of fertilizers for increasing grain production, Marin asked Frundsberg to swear to keep it secret. Because this is the foundation for all the nobles in East Frisia to make a fortune. And Frundsberg himself was also an important beneficiary of the vested interest groups. In response to Marin's request, Frundsberg swore without hesitation. After all, his estate was still there, and his family had moved in. Keeping this secret was actually protecting his own interests. After all, if the secret of the fertilizer was leaked, food prices would plummet, which would damage the interests of Frundsberg himself. After getting Frundsberg's assurance, Marin was completely relieved. Frundsberg was a knight who attached great importance to honor, and his oath was still very guaranteed. As for the issue of Frundsberg helping the emperor train the army, Marin never cared about it. Because, so far, the reforms Marin has implemented in the army are only the 1.0 version of the modern army. The Spanish phalanx is the lowest level of phalanx, and it is not a pity even if someone learns it. In the future, when the supply of gunpowder is more sufficient, Marin plans to launch new battle formations such as the Morris phalanx and the Gustav line. These battle formations are more powerful. But there is no such condition at present. Because of the difficulty in supplying saltpeter, Marin can only temporarily use the Spanish phalanx with the lowest proportion of musketeers. When the supply of Indian saltpeter is stable, Marin will increase the proportion of musketeers. Frundsberg and other officers who were found to be more inclined to the emperor went south with 2,500 reinforcements. At the same time, Marin also wrote a letter to Maximilian I, explaining the difficulties. He said that there were too many enemies around and he could not spare more troops, otherwise there would be a danger of being wiped out. Finally, Marin also implicitly proposed that the emperor help him get a seat in the imperial parliament. Sending troops is not for nothing, and Marin is not a fool, so there must be an exchange of interests. Marin currently has no plans to expand his territory, and the emperor can't offer any other benefits at the moment. Therefore, helping Marin get a seat in the imperial parliament is the most realistic condition. Only by entering the imperial parliament, which was attended by almost all German princes, could Marin be considered a widely recognized noble. Otherwise, if he could not even enter the imperial parliament, he would always feel inferior to others. Marin's plan was to first infiltrate the imperial parliament, then find a way to become a duke, and finally, after acquiring enough territory, upgrade to a kingdom. Moreover, Marin hinted in the letter that if he entered the imperial parliament, he would send another phalanx over.